Hello and welcome. In this lab, we're going to learn how to create a workflow in Fabric. Our use case will be a simplified application for a loan. In the interest of time, we won't be starting from scratch. Instead, download and import this Fabric application from the link shown below. It includes all the services that we will later compose to create our Fabric workflow. It includes a mock data service we will later use as a dummy credit bureau. Mock services just return dummy data, and are useful for when you don't have an actual backend to test against. This returns a pseudo-random credit score between 300 and 850. For the purpose of testing, even personal IDs will get an excellent score. IDs ended in 5 will get a good score, and all other IDs will get a poor score. The app also includes an object service with one data model, which represents our applicant's submission of a request to get a loan. The status of this model will drive our workflow. The app also includes one business rule, which will determine whether the applicant's credit score is good enough to be granted a loan. If the score is really good, we'll approve it automatically. If it's really bad, we'll reject it automatically. And if it's anywhere in between, we'll ask a credit analyst to review it. You may recognize that the syntax for business rules is based on YAML. Like with many other types of services in Fabric, you can test your business rules with different payloads directly from the Fabric console. Now we'll proceed to composing all of these services into a Fabric workflow. From the Workflow tab, click to create a new workflow. Name your workflow and select the object service and business model that came with the starter app we just imported. Select the model's status field, which will now serve to drive the model through the workflow. Creating a workflow adds a start event and a first user action to the canvas. Rename this to Submit Application and set the valid state transitions to New, Review, Rejected, and Approved. Notice you cannot save a workflow in an inconsistent state. Therefore, you must always add a provisional end event to every possible path in order to save progress. Now we will add a service task to the workflow, just before the end event. You will have to reconnect the arrows accordingly. Rename this service task to Get Credit Score. Select Integration as the type of the service we will be invoking. Then select the mock credit bureau service we imported and its Get Score operation. Click to configure the inputs to call this service. The dropdown will show all the input parameters the service accepts. Select the backend response namespace to take the input value from the loan application business model, and type IDDoc as the name of the model's field we'll take that value from. Click to configure what to do with the output of the service, and provide a name to attach the service response so we can use it later. Now that we've retrieved the applicant's credit score, let's add that to the model. Add a new service task and name it Update Application. This time, select Object as the type and select the Credit Application Model. To update the model, select the Put operation. Click to configure the inputs to invoke the update. Add the ID from the latest model operation to update the correct model instance. Map the score we retrieved from the prior service invocation to the model's score field. Remember, we had attached it by the name Credit to the workflow namespace. To test our progress so far, we will publish our workflow to a Fabric runtime environment. Publishing may take a few seconds. Once the application is published, click the workflow icon to navigate to the console of the runtime environment you've chosen. This will take you directly to the workflow section in the environment's console. Click the Loan Applications workflow. This screen lists the instances of a workflow execution. There will be none yet. Navigate to the Object Services section in the console. To trigger a workflow, we will have to create an instance of its associated model. Select the Loans Application Object Service and the application model. Select the Create operation and add a payload that includes all mandatory fields, except the ID and score. Notice the object service we imported automatically generates the ID of the loan application. To see if our workflow is working, let's now invoke the Get operation. This will return the loan application we just created, but notice that the workflow has now added a credit score, generated by our mock credit bureau. If we go back to Workflow Services in the console, we will see that there is now one execution under the Loans application workflow. Notice the execution is in completed status, and clicking the Run will show us all the steps executed while the model went through the workflow. Since this is working as expected so far, we can go back to the Fabric console to continue to build our workflow. Next, we'll add an invocation of the business rule we imported. Notice we're adding this just before the model update. This rule will determine whether the score is good enough to approve or bad enough to reject. Anything in the middle will have to be reviewed. Name the rule Assess Score and select the Loan Approvals rule set and the Assess Score rule. Click to configure the input parameters for the business rule. Map the business rule's score input parameter. We will again take this value from the credit object we attached to the workflow namespace. Click to configure what to do with the output of the rule invocation. Attach the output of the rule to an object named Rule1 in the workflow namespace. We will now update the model using the rules decision as the new status of the loan application. Let's go back to the inputs of the Update Application Service task and map the status field from the model to the rules output which we had attached to the workflow namespace. Now that we've updated the model with the decision, the workflow must do different things depending on the model's new status. We will achieve this by adding an exclusive gateway just after the model update. Rename this to Gateway 1. Next, add a message event between the gateway and the end event. Name this gateway option is approved and click the button to add an entry criteria. Add a condition to evaluate whether the value of rule1.decision from the workflow namespace equals approved. Save that and click the button to compose the message. Fill in the required fields with the appropriate text, using the dollar symbol to specify variables. In this case, notice we're using a variable for the recipient and another to personalize the message's body. The names of these variables are arbitrary, but you must map them in the Parameters tab to the right. In this case, we are mapping the message's email variable to the model's email field and the message's name variable to the model's first name field. Notice here we've purposely made one of the email variables different from the model's field to illustrate how these need not be the same. Now let's add the equivalent message event for the rejection. Name it isRejected and click the button to specify its entry criteria. Like before, add a condition to evaluate whether the value of rule1.decision from the workflow namespace equals rejected. Click the button to compose the rejection message. Like before, use $email to specify the recipient and $name to personalize the message's content. Again, click the Parameters tab from the right and map email to the model's email field and name to the model's first name field. Notice that here you must not use the dollar symbol. Remember to give a different name to each task, gateway, and message. This will improve readability of the execution and help you troubleshoot should you run into issues. Add a new end event after the rejection message event. Now, let's remember that our score assessment rule could also leave an application in standby, awaiting review. And keep in mind that in a gateway, all possible flows must be covered in order to avoid errors. To handle this review state, add a new user task just after Gateway 1. Call it Needs Review and click the button to add its entry criteria. Like before, add a condition to evaluate whether the value of rule1.decision from the workflow namespace equals review. Name the task review case and restrict the status the model may have after this task to approved or rejected. At this point, you may wonder how a user may interact with the workflow, since the user task appears to have no input or output. The answer is that this is just an entry point at which the workflow stops and awaits for input from a client application. For example, a credit analyst could use an app specific for his team to analyze and update cases. Provisionally, let's add an end event just after this new task, so we can save. Since after the case is reviewed, it can have two different states, we again want to do different things depending on what that state is. To achieve this, we'll add a new gateway and call it Gateway 2. Here, we can reuse the existing message events. Add a flow from Gateway 2 to the approval message event. Call it isApproved and click to define its entry criteria. Add a condition to evaluate whether the model's status equals approved. Notice that this time we're not evaluating rule1.decision because that will still equal review. What we want is to evaluate the new status of the model that will have been set externally by a user. Add a flow from Gateway 2 to the rejection message event. Call it isRejected and add a condition to evaluate whether the model's status equals rejected. Again, notice that at this point, what matters is not the business rules decision, but rather the model's status. With this, we're done designing our workflow. Now it's time to publish and test it again. Because we've added a couple of gateways, this time we'll test with different payloads, each crafted to go down a different route in the workflow. Once the application is published, click the workflow icon again to go to the console of the runtime environment. Clicking on the loans application workflow should show the execution of the prior test. We will now fire a couple more. To do that, just like before, click the Object Services menu option, select the loan application model and the create operation. To test the automatic approval, add a payload for an applicant with an even personal identification number. Once the creation is successful, go back to Workflow Services, click the Loans Application Workflow and notice there's now a new run. If you navigate here quickly enough, you may find that this new execution is still in running state. Click the refresh button to see if it has now completed. Click this latest workflow run to drill down into its steps. Notice that the applicant received such an excellent credit score that it went down the automatic approval path. Now let's test the review path. Go back to Object Services and again select the loan application model and the create operation. This time around, provide a payload that includes an applicant's personal identification number which ends in 5. Remember that in this case, our dummy credit bureau service will return a credit score that is neither too good nor too bad. Once the new model instance is created, make a note of the auto-generated ID so you can later tell these instances apart. Go back to Workflow Services and select the loan application workflow. You'll see a third execution of the workflow has been fired. Click on this third execution. You'll see that it has paused in the review case user task, waiting for a user to update the model. Now let's pretend we're a credit analyst reviewing the case through a back office app. Go back to the loan application model, select the get operation, and search for this last application model by using the ID we got during creation. Here we can see the applicant's credit score is 670 and the status of the application is to review. Now we're going to reject this loan application by updating the model and setting its status to rejected. Once the update has been successful, you should see a total count of updated records of 1. Let's go back to Workflow Services and to our loan applications workflow. Click this latest execution and notice that, as a consequence of us updating the model, the workflow has gone down the rejection path. If we go back to the list of the workflow's executions, we'll eventually see it appears as completed. Then, provided you've configured Fabric Engagement Services to use your email server, your applicants will receive their notifications. That is all for now. Thank you for watching.